The Right to Know Act, a controversial piece of legislation before our City Council, would require police officers to identify themselves upon making a stop and explicitly request permission before searching an individual. In addition, the police department would have to publish on its website annual reports relating to use of force. And while by this time you'd expect there to be a policy gap between police reform advocates and the NYPD, the real tension is within the chamber. For one thing, Mayor de Blasio and Speaker Viverito are against many of the reform measures under consideration.
Here to help us understand the bill, including its progress from first being introduced back in January to the latest committee meeting last week, are Tina Longo, the attorney in charge of the criminal practice at Legal Aid Society. Welcome.
Hi,
Thank you very much for being here. Anthonine Pierre of Brooklyn Movement Center, welcome. And returning to BK Live, Lumumba Bandele of CPR and Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. Thank you all three for being here very much. Tina, let's start with you. Where do we stand now with the progress of the Right to Know Act?
Well, clearly, if we anybody who watched the City Council hearings either in person or streamed see that there's a real disconnect with what I think the NYPD believes the community wants and needs and sort of what the community wants and needs. And certainly there are council members who are really pushing for this, and we really support that. But there are others who are sort of taking a step back and saying they'll see where this goes. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. But what we do know is this: change is needed. We're at a time where we have continued to see for decades the need for change, the need for accountability, the need for transparency. So disheartened as a native New Yorker who's been doing this work both as the primary public defender at Legal Aid Society but also a New Yorker, is that there are people that are against this transparency. You have to start asking yourself why that is.
Right.
So why is that? Why are people against the transparency?
Well, what you see with the mayor and the police commissioner is they're against all reforms in general, right? And the idea is that we're trying to shift the balance of power. So right now, the police department holds a lot of power, and even the things that we're asking for are on the books, right? Like, so we're really just trying to make sure that the people of New York really get the powers that we're supposed to be having in police community interactions.
So I understand why the police in that way would be against it if they're against any reforms, right? They don't want to be police. They want to do their own policing for themselves. But why is the mayor against it? I mean,
Well, look,
I have the same question.
I
mean, truthfully, we know that most elected officials have to, in some way, deal with this power force of the police unions and the law enforcement kind of community. And I think that they have been wielding a significant amount of power, not just within New York City, but New York State, but also nationally, if you look at the larger scheme of things.
Yeah.
And I think that there's politics being played here. He wants to still maintain a relatively progressive kind of position, but when it comes to actual policies and making some changes, he is showing that he's not going to go but so far. And so our job is to really push him beyond that.
So how far does this law put us towards a solution, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, there's no silver bullet. When we're talking about ending discriminatory policing, ending police brutality, police murders, we know that it is a comprehensive approach that's going to be required. We know there's going to be policies that are needed to provide parameters as to how the police are able to maneuver and function within our communities. We know it's going to have to include a whole comprehensive grouping of social services and human service professionals looking at mental health as something as mental health as opposed to criminal behavior, issues around housing, issues around employment. All of these things, unfortunately, are dealt with on a first responders level by law enforcement. And therein you find a lot of the significant issues that we have. So there is no silver bullet. But what is absolutely mandatory is oversight and accountability.
So where does the law stand on that oversight and accountability that we need? I mean, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of Eric Gardner. People that support Eric and think about Eric every day, where do they stand with this law and how far it goes in, providing a solution, Tina?
Well, the first thing we should all recognize is that presently, right now in the patrol guide, there is a prohibition against police officers using chokeholds. So when NYPD goes and testifies that they're going to be able to sort of make this change without the law,
right,
without the chokehold prohibition being on the books as a law, you sort of have to question, well, why didn't that prevent Eric Gardner's death? Why didn't that prevent Officer Pantaleo from putting his arm around Eric Gardner in a takedown and choking him to death? So, you know, this law takes what is in the patrol guide and puts a light on it, puts the transparency and the accountability behind that. And again, the fact that we are here having a conversation sort of in the city about whether that's the right thing to do or not is really questioning. Of course it's the right thing. One of the things that we hear as the primary public defender, so we represent 216,000 New Yorkers who come through the criminal justice system. So when I hear the commissioner saying that things are changing in the community, that people who are being arrested feel respected, I have to strongly disagree with him. Our clients do not. Our clients are still getting disparately treated in communities of color, being arrested for things that in white communities would simply not be arrested for, like marijuana, like putting your foot up on a subway, like hanging out with your friends on the street corner if you're a kid. So you have this real disconnect. What the law does, sort of knowing who the name of the police officer who stopped you and is harassing you, the name of the partner that was with him that didn't stop him from doing it, the fact that we should make it a law that a police officer shouldn't use a chokehold for a takedown. And again, the law actually has carve-outs. So when we hear things like police safety, the law anticipates that and says that if the police officer feels as though they're in harm themselves or someone else is in harm, that there's a carve-out for that called justification under the law. So you know, we have to all start having an honest conversation about what is really happening in the city. The fact that NYPD left the room, said they want to hear from the community. Here's a hearing hosted by the city council. It was standing room only. The minute they finished testifying, the entire NYPD got up and walked out. Didn't even listen to Eric Gardner's mom.
And, you know, in the spirit of that honest conversation, as a follow-up question, can you explain to somebody like myself who doesn't understand why, if in the, you know, police guideline book, it says you can't use a chokehold, why somebody that uses one in order to kill a citizen isn't prosecuted under the law?
Well, and then that's the grand jury question, right?
Right, and it's not only the grand jury question. I mean, there's so many layers to that. I mean, we're looking at one of the worst cases that was caught on videotape. It's very important to know. So many young people like myself who are young, black, person of color, male, in New York City, understand that this is regular operating procedure. Like, I don't know what a regular arrest would look like if not to have an elbow thrown at you, a choke, whatever. That is how we are managed and dealt with, you know. And so just because there is within the guidebook rules that say you cannot do this, we understand there's a broader culture that said this is not only allowable, it's necessary. It's a part of your job. It's how you maintain control. It's how you establish this kind of understanding between the force in our communities.
So how do we define cops mistreating citizens? In other words, like, how do we redefine what is excessive force in terms of where it stands right now?
Right, and what's proportional to what's coming at them?
Anthony, would you like to comment on that?
Well, it's important to think about why cops are even approaching people on the street, right? So, again, in this patrol guidebook, we have cops are supposed to be approaching people if they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause, right? And what we see in a lot of situations is there's none of that. It's really just harassment, and the point of this bill is really to stop that kind of harassment and to hold folks accountable.
Right. And we really can't talk about, you know, use of force without talking about perceived criminality. You know, there's this idea that you know who are criminals based on appearance, based on so many other things, crime areas, all of that stuff, and then that sort of becomes a green light for you to do whatever is necessary to arrest, to alleviate crime, whatever it may be. But one thing we should look at, would Mayor de Blasio want his son to be arrested the way these young folks are on a regular basis? I think that's a good way to define what use of force is. How would you want your loved ones to be handled in the arms of law enforcement in an
that's a
interaction.
question, sort of posed to everybody, every citizen in New York City, New York State, is we see this with Raise the Age. You wouldn't want your own kid, if you were an upstate senator, sort of be 16 or 17-years-olds and prosecuted as an adult. So why would we want other people's children who are children of color to do it? So it's sort of, again, this honest conversation. One of the things that, I sort of raised the grand jury, and obviously we have been litigating sort of opening up the secrecy of this specific grand jury, because we believe and we have a lot of experience with the grand jury systems in every county, that this grand jury was supposed to investigate the killing of Eric Garner was so vastly different than what the average man of color or woman of color goes through when they're prosecuted and indicted. There's not 50 witnesses. There may be 1 or 2. It's not a 9-month grand jury. They have very little information, and you're indicted within 24 to 48 hours, sometimes less than 5 days.
And there's an intent to indict.
That's right.
This
That's
is not
right.
trial.
This was a sort of a trial, and so calling for opening that up, but let's remove that for a second, because we're litigating that, and hopefully the appellate court will sort of agree with us. But Officer Pantaleo is still an NYPD officer, right? Had his gun and shield taken away, fine. Where else? What other job, really?
Does that go on?
Does that go on where you're not suspending without pay, at least, or where there was not an arrest and then he could make bail? At least in other jurisdictions that has happened when there were police killings. But here in New York City, where we're supposed to be the leader, where this administration has been progressive on housing and looking at homelessness to some extent. We'd like them to do more for runaway and homeless youth, but there's a huge gap here.
And the only person arrested in all of this, of course, is the gentleman who videotaped this.
Yeah. Which is absurd. I mean, let's get back to the reforms. What are we looking at in terms of these reforms that we're facing right now? Anthonine, would you like to comment on that?
So the Right to Know Act is comprised of 2 bills. One bill it compels officers, when asked, to identify themselves by name, badge and shield number, also still in the patrol guide, but we feel that this is not what's happening in the streets in the day-to-day.
So these are actually already in the patrol guide?
Already in there, right? So what we're talking about, it's what Lumumba was talking about, right? So just sort of the implicit racism that happens in police interactions every single day, the only way that we see to get through this at this point is to legislate. So we're asking the city council and the mayor to do that. So that's the first bill, the ID bill. The second bill is the consent to search bill. So that speaks to officers really needing to communicate to folks what their rights are. And the fact that they can consent to a search, they have to consent to search if the police officers don't have probable cause or reasonable suspicion to approach them. So what we're seeing right now is cops are just randomly, and I see it all the time, they've got an APB out for a black male that's, maybe 14 to 30 or some crazy range, and they're going all over Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights where we work, stopping black men for no reason, asking them to empty their pockets, and then what happens, right? You empty your pockets and maybe you have something that you shouldn't have, now you're carted off. But you were just walking down the street minding your own business. So what we're saying is these bills are gonna allow people to essentially be in their neighborhoods and mind their own business and walk down the street without being essentially molested and perturbed by police presence.
What is the actual argument being made by the police against those bills? I mean, we've got a lot of new cadets coming in, the police force is just growing, and this is already in the guidelines. How are they really opposing these things?
Again, police are going to police, right? Like, they're always going to oppose any kind of check to their power, right? Police are saying that what we're doing and what we're saying is obstructionist to the way that they're going to be able to police and stop and reduce crime, right? But at the point that the things that we're asking for are already real regulations, there really isn't an argument there. And New York City has always been a kind of place that has tried to be really heavy on crime, especially because we're big on business and protecting private property in that way. So it has been an argument that rings very easily true for people, especially folks who are not experiencing the level of discrimination that you face as a person of color, as a queer person, as a young person, just being out in the street living your life.
So in terms of the police, what is the best way to police? I mean, what are we looking for in terms of the way the NYPD is trained and carry out their jobs as an ultimate solution to the problems that we've seen just in the past few years?
Right,
again,
especially when wanting to search somebody,
And
let's
again,
say.
it's not the ultimate solution. You know, really what we're doing, what we're looking at, and this is the reason why we're having this discussion, because they're pushed back with any kind of oversight or accountability that's attempted to have to happen on their part. And so this is only one piece. You know, we want this piece of legislation to pass. We're looking for the governor to sign this executive order that will allow for an independent body to prosecute cases, not just of unarmed people killed by the police. We are really still encouraging our communities to monitor the police. Like, if you see someone being accosted by, stand. If you don't have a video camera, whatever, but stand there. We have to change the culture that exists between the police and our communities.
I think it's a time, you know, particularly you have, okay, so we have 1,300 more officers coming, and a lot of people have questioned that, and including me. If, in fact, Commissioner Bratton is serious about changing the culture, and sort of that's what you heard in the testimony, leave it to us. Give us a chance. We have these 13 new cadets coming on. We're going to do it different. We've been training different. It has to sort of be about accountability, too. So if you train them, training somebody isn't enough. Right. It is about holding that person accountable, either under the law for breaking the law, or if there is a special prosecutor and that person has been found to sort of not have broken the law, there are other disciplinary actions that take place. And I think what happens is when we talk to our clients who are frustrated, the young people in the community continuing to be harassed, our trans population who continues to be arrested for loitering for prostitution because police just simply think if you wear a short dress and a blouse and standing on a corner and you're trans, therefore you're prostituting. The fact is you have to hold people accountable, and what these bills do and what we've been trying to do with our Cop Accountability Project, which is tracking the data from CCRB and PACER, which is the database of federal lawsuits, and sort of hearing from communities. We put all of this in a database for all of our defenders. That we need that because we need to make the argument in court that this police officer is actually excessive force. Otherwise, you can't litigate it and sort of can't cross-examine them. But it's a broader sort of turning a light on the problems. If you have an officer who has a significant background in excessive force claims that have been substantiated, then the question for the NYPD is, what are you doing about that officer? He or she's been trained already.
Right.
He or she's been trained. And you can tell them you can retrain. At what point do they stop becoming an NYPD officer if they can't follow the rules? And that's what this push of law is, and this is what sort of the call for accountability is. You don't get real reform simply by saying, you know, I have 1,300 officers. We're on it. Trust us.
No, you get real reform by voicing your opinion. I think the majority of New Yorkers agree with the three of you. So we want to thank you for being here and thank you for voicing those opinions. We urge everyone watching to be involved with you, and we urge you guys to please come back because it's an ongoing conversation, of course. And thank you for being here, sincerely.
Thanks for having the conversation.
Oh, no, thank you.